G'day, my name's John Dadd and I work for Conserve Agriscience here on the Liverpool Plains in New South Wales. What I'd like to talk to you this morning is 5 key factors for successful grain storage. Firstly, it's having a harvest and grain marketing plan. Secondly, it's undertaking a pre-harvest facility setup. Thirdly, it's ensuring that you use the most effective grain protectants. Number 4 is undertaking best practice application. And the final one, number 5, is undertaking a post-application checklist. Let's follow these through in more details. The first point is to have a harvest and grain marketing plan. So fundamentally, who's going to buy my grain? We obviously have historical markets, but it's important to understand when we're talking about grain protection, who's going to be the end user. Associated with that is what is the period of storage. So if it's going to be a long term or short term, what are we going to be requiring? Are we going to protect it with a protectant, or is it short term and we'll be able to get away with aeration and fumigation? What's really important is the protectant residues these markets accept. A market such as the EU, it's all PRF. If it's a domestic milling market or a feed market, then protectant residues are often accepted. It's really important to check these before applying anything. It's really important to rotate grain protectants. We want to avoid resistance in the onset of this, particularly for lesser grain borer. And with the hustle and bustle of harvest, it's really critical to plan what volumes of protectants or fumigants are going to be required. These are pretty easy to work out because storage is set a certain cubic metres or tonnage, and we can work these out prior to the harvest commencing. The second point is about the pre-harvest facility setup. This is really important in terms of lowering the overall insect pressure you're likely to be faced during the storage period. It's about the hygiene in, being the silo, and the storage facilities on the outside, so around the yard. Hygiene in the silo, we want to make sure that all the dusk and husk that's built up on the ribbing of the edges of the silo or beams is brought down and washed out. Any of the old grain or in the dead spots and transfer channels and outloading augers, we want to make sure that that's also removed. This needs to be washed out and a structural treatment applied. So the structural treatment can be either Reldan or phenitrathione or the alike, but it's really important to check that the commodity that you're treating does accept those residues of that product, because the commodity will pick up the residues from that structural treatment. Most important to use is diatomaceous earth, or dry side's a key brand in that market. And dry side is important to dust all surfaces of the interior of the silo, and also in any dead spots in any of the transfer channels where grain's likely to build up. It's most important to treat those with diatomaceous earth. In terms of the silo complex, it's really important to make sure that points of harbourage are removed for rodents and also husk and grain residues, because this also supports an external source of infestation. All these insects have wings. The ecology of them, we do know that they can fly for several kilometres and are attracted strongly by the scent of grain. So as we can see here in this hopper, it hasn't been cleaned since the outload, and we can see it's all mouldy, and it's potentially going to lead to an infestation or contaminate grain that's being outloaded. On this hopper here, we can see that fresh grain has been outturned. It's still important to empty and clean those out. Any of the piles of grain around the silos are really important to pick up, remove, and ideally bury, because if we just go and dump them in the farm pit sort of a kilometre away, then these insects, as I said, can fly and are strongly attracted by the scent of grain. It's really important to clean and check your aeration fans, because as at this site here, they principally rely on aeration. So aeration fans, give them a blowout, make sure there's no cobwebs, make sure that the engines, the generators, they're all serviced, they're ready to go. It's really important when we're looking at sealed silos is to make sure we pressure test them in the pre-season, just to test if there's any hatch seals or there's any leaks developing in a certain spot, so we can really determine, is our gas tight storage actually gas tight. It's really important to decontaminate augers and pumps from the use of pickles and any of the residues that might be associated with any of the seeding products that people have put on. Any equipment that's been used to treat or elevate treated grain into the seeder, it's really important to get those chemicals that have been used, mostly the fungicides, but they are an issue with the trade in contaminating grain, particularly when it's for export, because the residue testing procedures are really thorough. So every hatch of every vessel that leaves Australia is tested. The final one is to calibrate augers and your spray pump output. The calibration really determines the output of the grain, which we then need to match 1 litre of product per tonne of grain. So on the auger you can see here, that generally puts out 120 tonnes per hour, which is 2 litres per minute. So we need to ensure that we check the nozzles in the pre-season, and we ensure that once the nozzle's been replaced, we test the output so the new nozzle and the pressure is adjusted so we're getting 2 litres of output per minute. When you're doing that also, the angle of the auger does vary with the output, and it's really important to calibrate your machine when it's on the angle of the silo you're going into, because the higher the angle going up, the slower the output of the commodity will be. And vice versa, the lower the angle, the faster the output. So ensure that you think about that when your pre-season setup. The third key success factor of grain protection is using effective grain protectants. The latest grain protectant that we offer is Conserve Plus, which is an in-can combination of spinosad and S-methoprene. Unlike Conserve on farm, it was S-methoprene, spinosad and chlorpyrifos-methyl. This formulation, decoupling the chlorpyrifos-methyl out of it, unleashes new flexibility to treat all cereal grains. Conserve Plus is guided by the Controller Product Supply Stewardship Program. By this, you can only buy it through accredited agents. You must have an NGR card at the point of purchase, which this is transferred the number through to the end user declaration, which you must understand and sign. Part of the condition of this is that when you sell the grain, that you will inform the future owners of the grain that it's been treated with spinosad, so no subsequent applications can occur and lead to a potential trade disruption through exceedance of MRLs. One of the key factors about Conserve Plus is that it does require an organophosphate mixing partner. This is because chlorpyrifos-methyl or phenitrathione are the only actives that control rice weevil. So it's important to use Reldan or phenitrathione at the required rates. Both will provide up to 6 to 9 months control, but with this you need to understand that there is a withholding period apply to the high rate of phenitrathione. Yeah. So for the crop, it covers all cereal grains. The pests, it's lesser grain borer, rusty flower beetle, sawtooth grain beetle and flat grain beetle. It's 500 mils per 50 litres of water and apply at the rate of 1 litre of diluted solution per tonne of grain. Rice weevil's not controlled and you must add in organophosphate mixing partner to control this insect. The fourth aspect of achieving best grain protection is undertaking or following best practice application. And essentially that is making sure that when we're executing the treatment process that we're doing it right. So we mix it up right, we apply it right. So this is the doing part of grain protection. Fundamentally, we can't treat or store wet grain. So if that load is too wet to deliver to a receival site, then don't store it on farm, because that will lead to issues down the road. If you're treating wet grain, the moisture elevates or increases the rate of degradation of the active ingredients, which will result in a poorer period of control. It's always in the wet spot of sheds or the silo that's got the leak that you'll have that hot spot of infestation. So part of your pre-site checkup is make sure you seal up silos and fundamentally don't treat wet grain. As employers, we're going to make sure that our staff undertake all protective measures to make sure we keep them safe. Wearing personal protective equipment or PPE is fundamental with any insecticide application, and we recommend that you follow this. As you can see here, I've got the overalls on, I've got my rubber boots on, I've got my green nitriles, I've got my respirator, and the respirator canister, make sure you change that every year, and between uses, store it away, put it back into its carton so it's not getting dust and being exposed to other potential chemicals. And finally, your face mask, whilst it does seem clumsy, is really important for spills and splashes, so you want to avoid that in contact with your face. So importantly, stay safe, wear your PPE. Reading the label correctly is paramount to following the label directions, and the label directions are critical in terms of following what commodities the different products can treat. As we know, Conserve Plus treats all cereal grains, but if we're going to partner it with Reldam, we've got to make sure that we don't treat rice, malt barley or maize. So in the instance here, we're going to be mixing up a load to treat some wheat that's going to go to a local feed mill, and both these actives are accepted by the marketer. In terms of the batch filling process, what we're going to be looking at here is if we fill up to about 40 litres, we only need to make 50 tonnes of treatment. We fill up to 40 litres of water, we have the agitation going. It's important to have the agitation going. We always shake the bottle first because it's suspension concentrate, and we're going to make sure that any material that might have settled is suspended. We shake that well, put it into the tank when it's agitating. Give that a minute or two to homogenise in the tank, so equalise and then we put in the Reldam. So it's a litre of Reldam per 50 litres of water. So this will treat 50 tonnes of grain. So agitate that, fill it up to the 50 litre mark, let it agitate, and then we're ready to spray. A key thing to remember is agitation between when you're treating and you might turn the pump off, waiting for the next load to come in from the paddock. What's really important there is when you pull up in your truck, switch on the pump, switch it on for a good 5 minutes before, just in case any of the material might have settled. So you want to make sure that every litre that remains in that tank is basically the same in terms of the concentration. So there is potential, if it sits for longer periods, that it may settle out. So it's really important that you have good agitation, at least if the product's been sitting idle for some hours. What's really important about Conserve Plus is that you mix up enough solution to allow for 1 day's treatment. You can't let the solution sit for longer than 48 hours because the active ingredients start to degrade. So when you're looking at your batches, just look to make up a fresh batch every day if you can, and make sure you agitate it thoroughly before application. What we're targeting with this solution that we've made up 50 litres, and then we're targeting 1 litre of this solution per tonne of grain. So that is applied into an auger as it's being elevated, or what they call admixture applied. So we're adding it to the grain as it's being elevated and then cascades into the silo. All this is important for the mixing process. 1 litre of tonne doesn't cover all kernels that are being treated. What is really important to know is that the insects move throughout the consignment of grain, and that's how they pick up the active ingredient dose. So what we're talking about is applying admixture via our nozzle onto the auger, and as we can see on this barrel here is the nozzle's located 2/3 the way down the barrel. This is because this barrel has a high lift to get into these very big silos. What you don't want to have is the treatment at the very bottom will create extra drag and affect the overall output of the auger. So this nozzle here is suitably located towards the end of the barrel, and it still has adequate time to mix in before it cascades out into the silo. The location of the spray nozzle is important to have closer to the to where it's coming out of the truck, literally for people being able to see if the nozzle's blocked or not. That is really the physical benefit of it. You can see how the spray nozzle pattern is going if it's into the receiver. But if you want to have any further information about this, just check up our product control manual for Conserve Plus, which has some suggestions where to find this. What's important is that you don't use tube veyors or the conveyor belts which are commonly used with pulses to elevate, because we do get poorer coverage of the commodity, and we don't advocate the use of Conserve treating grain that's being elevated into storages with tube veyors, so please avoid this. As with any chemical application, it's important to fill out post-application your spray application logbook, and importantly note the commodity that you treat with what products and at what rates. So that's important for referencing when you go to fill out your commodity vendor declaration later, and also for referencing back to as to if withholding periods apply for different mixing partners. So there's some of the key things that relate to best practice application. The final element of a successful grain protection outcome is undertaking a post-application checklist. So that is really fundamental as to, we've gone through all the hard work, we want to make sure that we complete the post-storage checks. So really, once the grain goes into storage and we seal the hatches, we want to turn on the aeration and run it on rapid. If it's on auto controller, it's more suitable. But it's really important to get that aeration going fast and cool that grain down. As part of an effective program, we want to monitor monthly. Obviously, in the first month or two, people are probably in the wind down phase from harvest, but essentially it's that sort of second, third, fourth, fifth month. What we want to just make sure, particularly if it's just running on aeration and cooling, is we want to make sure that we undertake a fumigation within the first month to make sure that if there's any insects transferred from the field, that they're cleaned up. Remember, with fumigation, it's always in a sealed silo, and we've already tested it for gas tightness, so we know that we're going to maintain that concentration by time. In terms of monitoring hatches, we're just obviously going to make sure we clear silos from fumigants before we open hatches, and so that's all through our record keeping processes. We know what's happened. But what we can also do in storages is have pitfall traps, which we can monitor insects with those, and they're commonly available. We can also put pheromone traps around the silo complex. So it's really important to make sure that we undertake our hygiene also to clean up any post-harvest treatment spills, so we just keep that whole complex nice and tidy. And always, when you're selling grain, please use a commodity vendor declaration to declare that if a grain protectant's been applied, that the future owners of the grain know that that's on the grain. So by following these 5 key steps that we've outlined, hopefully we can lead you to a successful grain protection outcome, which means when your market opportunity or your client wants the grain, you can outturn the grain and you can meet the delivery requirement specifications.